Good morning. I'm Mark Philpart of the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color and Policy Link. Policy Link is a 21-year-old racial justice organization advocating for policy and systems change on behalf of our country's most economically insecure. And the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color is a network that we support advocating for policy and systems change on behalf of boys and men of color, their families, and communities. Thank you for joining the first of 8 Cannabis, Race, and Equity virtual convenings. Today's session will provide participants with an overview of how cannabis legalization intersects with various aspects of equity and racial justice, including the impact of the war on drugs on communities of color, economic equity, cannabis tax revenues, and public health. Before we begin, I'd like to situate this web series in the moment our nation is in, where we're seeing attempts to maintain white supremacy and eschew democracy at the very highest levels of our government. We must tell the truth about these acts and those like them which litter our past, the genocide, the stealing of land, and slavery. Only by telling these truths and repairing the harm through systemic change will our nation ever move forward. Throughout this series, we plan to tell the truth about the war on drugs and the harm it's caused to our families and communities. In California, the first steps to repairing that harm have been taken with the successful passage of Prop 64. And through Prop 64, we have a tremendous opportunity to begin to repair the harm and heal our communities. And throughout this series, we hope you'll learn about the ways in which you can join that movement. Today's session is brought to you by our partners who have been on the ground working in communities and leading the efforts to repair the harm caused by the war on drugs. Thank you to Public Health Advocates, Drug Policy Alliance, A New Way of Life, Legal Services for Prisoners with Children, Restoring Justice for Indigenous Peoples, and of course our co-host, Youth Forward, who you'll hear from in just a moment. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll dive into presentations related to the racial disparities in California's marijuana arrests, gain insights into the history of the war on drugs and the campaign for decriminalization, and the intersections of cannabis policy and race and equity. Then we'll hear from a panel of advocates who are working with directly impacted communities so we understand what work is already happening and the work that still needs to be done. We will then close out the conversation with Q&A. If you have any questions that you want to ask the presenters or panelists, you're able to drop them into the comment section on YouTube where we're live streaming, and we'll be filtering through the entire event so we can get to them at the end. Thank you to our partners and co-sponsors. Our partners and co-sponsors have really made this event rich. Without them, this event wouldn't have happened. And I also want to shout out the larger set of organizations who've committed to sharing their wisdom and work. I also want to thank the co-sponsors who have invested their time and resources to ensure that the work is successful. The California Endowment, the California Community Foundation, the California Wellness Foundation, the Center at Sierra Health Foundation, Liberty Hill Foundation, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, and the California Department of Healthcare Services. It's critical for us as we get into this conversation to get grounded in the history of this issue and understand the series of policy choices that have fueled cycles of poverty, criminalization, and incarceration in Black and Brown communities. It's not only important to know history, but we must also understand it and do the necessary work to make sure that this doesn't happen again and that we all heal from the war on drugs. Growing up, I wasn't taught this history, but I saw the result of the tough on crime era and the war on drugs in my community and my own family. Bonds broken, friends and families addicted to drugs, and harms that span across generations that have decimated entire communities. So as we're going through this process and doing the work and remembering the past and unearthing some of the policy decisions that have created these circumstances, we must push policymakers, funders, and all of us to do the work in a way that is grounded in the reparations framework. For there to be true reconciliation, and healing, the investments, the programming, and policies need to be bold and transformative enough to rebuild the communities from the ground up. Again, thank you so much for joining, and I'm going to hand it over to our partners at the Youth Forward team. Jim?
Great, thank you, Mark, and thank you for that excellent introduction. I just wanted to add to Mark's overview that these upcoming 8 sessions, our session next week on Tuesday has to do with the new grant programs that were created by Proposition 64 and that are funded by state cannabis tax revenues. We'll have the state agencies that are administering these new grant programs and that are making grants in to the tune of millions of dollars to nonprofits, to tribal organizations, and to local governments across the state. Those agencies will be with us next Tuesday, and you'll be able to see all 4 grant programs at one time, which I believe is the first time that we've ever pulled this all together to share with folks around the state, this comprehensive view of the Prop 64 grant programs. So I just wanted to make that pitch. We started planning this convening before the pandemic. And of course, we thought that the pandemic would have ended by now and we would be able to do it in person. We transitioned to doing this virtual series with the 8 sessions. And as with Mark, I want to thank all of our presenters today and the presenters who will be helping lead the coming sessions. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Jim. Now we're going to get straight into our first presentation. We'll be hearing from Dr. Flo Kofer, Senior Director of Policy at Public Health Advocates, to learn more about the racial disparities in California's marijuana arrests.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the warm welcome and for hosting this event. I'm really grateful for this opportunity and for the ability to be able to set some context as we begin this conversation today. The important thing to recognize is that there are clear racial disparities in California's marijuana arrests and the overall criminalization that occurred when it came to marijuana. The big thing we want to remind ourselves of, though, is that didn't happen by chance. It happened by design. And so part of what we have worked together with many of the partners who are sponsoring this program today to do is to think through what we needed to know to be able to not only make the case for why for the fact that this had happened, but also for why we need to really seriously consider how we respond and what elements of restorative justice we're engaging in when it comes to addressing historic wrongs and making sure that our communities are protected. And so one of those ways is a report that we published last year called When the Smoke Clears. And this is looking at the racial disparities in California's marijuana arrests. And so if we think about this overall, the impact of the war on drugs in California is that it caused what we would classify today as a community trauma. It wasn't always thought of that way in historical context, but today we recognize that incarceration and family separation doesn't just impact the person who was incarcerated, it impacts the entire family and more broadly the entire community. But more specifically, if someone was convicted of a felony related to marijuana, this could potentially jeopardize their immigration status, their custody of their children, their employment, their housing, and their social services, even if that person didn't spend time behind bars. And if we think about the prosecution, it was largely concentrated in Black and Latino communities. And when we look at these disparities in terms of who was arrested and who was prosecuted, it's entirely attributable to racial bias in law enforcement. In fact, 90% of the cases that were prosecuted were for simple possession. And so I can't underscore that enough, that it's entirely attributable to racial bias in law enforcement. Because one of the things that we know that is true is that drug use is relatively similar across racial and ethnic groups. But what we don't see is that the arrest rates mirror that. And so part of what we were able to quantify in our report is the disparities in those arrest rates. And if we look across these racial and ethnic groups, we see certainly that people are using marijuana similar to other drugs at about the same rate, but statewide, Black people were 4 times more likely to be arrested than white people. And this has to do with how we characterized marijuana use, who we suspected for the use, and who we were willing to criminalize for the use. And we see a peak somewhere near 2008, so not nearly as long ago, if we're looking back over the last 24 years or so, than we would have expected. We weren't actually seeing a decline in the arrest rates in the way that we would have thought over time, but actually an increase that was occurring from 96 until almost 2008, and then a precipitous decline thereafter. In addition to thinking more globally about the statewide arrests, there also are geographic disparities in the marijuana arrests. And so if we were to take a look at the map of California, we see that there are certain places that are going to have a much higher arrest rate than other places. And so this map is looking at the ratio of arrests between Black and white Californians. And what we see is that the median for those arrests is somewhere around 6 times more likely. Remember, the state average was 4 times more, but that's driven by the fact that some places are a little lower than average and some places are higher. And so looking at the map, you see how brown and in one place purple it is, and you're able to recognize just how many places are actually higher than the 4 times average, and that they're being sort of skewed by the polls, but really that this is a statewide problem with some places having an even greater disparity than the 4 times would show. And so if we're then further able to drill down into this, we see that if we were to take it as an example from this report, we did a drill down on the counties throughout California, looking at the local law enforcement agencies. And so taking as an example, Sacramento, we see that Black Sacramento residents were arrested on marijuana-related charges 29 times more often than white residents, which is 7 times the state average. So even within that map that we were showing, where we were saying, some places were higher than average, there are places even below the county level where these rates were much, much higher. Other notably high cities are places like Palo Alto with 26 times, Southgate, again, 26 times, Oakland and Berkeley with 25 times, Fremont at 23 times, South San Francisco with 22 times, and Citrus Heights with 21 times. So even when we're looking at the cities within a county, those disparities can be even more exacerbated. And this brings us to really think about what is the impact, right? Because these disparities then often translate into a portion of the folks who are arrested are going to be convicted. And so when we look at a comparison between white and Black and Latinx folks in California, we see that when we look at our Latinx population, that when it comes to felonies, Latinx people were 26 times more likely to be convicted of felonies, and 45% more likely, 26% more likely to be convicted of felonies, and 45% more likely to be convicted of misdemeanors. Whereas when it came to felonies for the Black population in California, it's 500% higher, which is 5 times higher a rate of felony convictions, and 100% higher when it came to misdemeanors. So essentially 2-fold higher when it came to the impact of those arrests in terms of which ones actually translated into convictions. And so we would be remiss if we didn't further talk about some of the geographic disparities, because even within, a city or county, we don't certainly see the same level of policing happening. And we recognize, again, that this is entirely attributable to racial disparities in law enforcement in terms of where we chose to criminalize. And so if we look, again, just using Sacramento as an example, but our report details several places where we do a deeper dive into the local data, we see that the top 5 booking census tracts in Sacramento also have median household incomes ranging from $12,355 to $36,902, which is overall less than 60% of the state median income. And so these are often our poorest, and in many cases, the places where there's a confluence of Black and Indigenous and other people of color living. And so those racial disparities also reflect economic disparities in how we have chosen to criminalize this. And so what that brings us to in terms of really thinking about this issue is how it was framed. And I know we are going to have a deeper conversation about that later in this session about how criminalization overall was framed. But I want people to recognize that we have this as a resource to you to be able to look at your local data and think about what happened and use that as a guide for what should come as a follow-up to be able to right some of these historic wrongs and to be able to address these clear disparities that existed that were, again, by design.
Thank you, Dr. Flo. This is, just really appalling data. Unfortunately, this is a set of trends that our state has been on for far too long. And I just really appreciate you for unearthing it and sharing it with us and using it to fuel some of the important demands that we know we must make in order to repair the harm caused in our communities. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to now turn to Jeanette Zanapatin. Jeanette is the California State Director at Drug Policy Alliance, and she's going to talk about the history of the war on drugs and the campaign for decriminalization. Jeanette, please take it away.
So first of all, I just want to say thank you for having me be here. I'm really honored to be in the company of all the folks that are serving as panelists today. I think this is a very important and salient conversation that we're having, especially given the moment that we're at right now in our, unfortunate history of our country. But yes, my name is Jeanette Zanapatin. I am the California State Director for Drug Policy Alliance. I've been the director for 2 years and came to Drug Policy Alliance after having worked up in Sacramento, primarily on civil rights and immigrant rights issues. I've done state level policy work for about the last 20 years. And so it was a natural progression to go into Drug Policy Alliance, given my background on immigration and ICE police collaboration, as well as working on several, criminal justice reform measures. And having that background is sort of what I bring to DPA with my immigration legal background as well. So happy to be here and give you sort of an overview and just give you the context of why we're here, right? Why we're at this moment with the amazing report that Dr. Coffer just gave us. And so just a brief overview, I'm going to do some really light touches because I only, I'm trying to get through as much of this as possible, but just to give you guys the overview of the war on drugs and how it rolled out in the US and how racialized it was. In the 1870s, we saw the first anti-drug law passed in America by the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 1875. And this law was aimed solely at Chinese that were smoking opium and not really targeting medicinal opium that was mostly consumed by whites. And given the context, this was right after, the major gold rush and the major influx of immigrants and Asian immigrants on the West Coast. And this was really a manifestation of that. And so that's really the first law that we saw in the books that really not only began the war on drugs, but really started giving us the racialized context and lens for how the war on drugs would evolve in our country. And then in the 1900s, we have the Harrison Narcotics Acts of 1914 that really just started to regulate and tax the production and distribution of both opium and cocaine. And if we look at this context as well, it was really targeted towards African Americans. There was newspaper headlines talking about the impact that cocaine was having on African American communities and how that would really seek to undermine public safety for particularly white communities. And so, again, we're seeing how the overlap between the war on drugs and the racialization of these laws continue to evolve. And then by the 1930s, we saw the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. And this has particular context here within California. Many maybe know the history of Randolph Hearst and his role within the newspaper industry. Hearst was a longtime California resident, really, really just upset at the role that Latinos and Mexicans were playing within California, and really targeted Mexican and Latinos even during the 1930s. And so it's no mistake that we call marijuana by the Spanish name. So again, the othering of what the impact of the war on drugs and who we are impacting by passing these laws. And so, just looking at sort of within that context, how this all evolved again. And then over the course of, the Nixon administration, that was the official declaration. I'll say official as the war on drugs. We know that we have tapes of the Nixon administration really targeting Black and Brown communities with the influx of the war on drugs, and looking at, and looking at the laws that were passed during the 70s around Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. In the 80s, we have the comprehensive, in the 70s, we created the 5 federal drug schedules that still exist today. In the 80s, we have the Comprehensive Crime Control Act that established longer sentences and increased bail amounts for drug offenders. And then we also have the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established the 101 crack versus powder cocaine disparities. This disparity, the 101 disparity was reduced to 18-1 by the Fair Sentencing Act in 2010. But again, we see how all of this evolved within the racial context. And in the 90s, we saw the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act that basically stated anyone who was convicted of a drug offense was immediately disqualified from receiving welfare and food stamp assistance. And just to give a little bit more context as well, in the 90s, we also saw 2 really harsh immigration reform measures, the first being IRA, and the second was EDIPA, that really sought to not only create harsher penalties for drug offenses, but really knocked out about hundreds of thousands of folks out of eligibility to be able to fight their deportations. And so again, we're seeing how all of these laws and policies are being passed at the federal level, and it's by no accident that we're here today. So by 2018, what we're seeing is every 20 seconds, someone is arrested for a drug violation in the US. More than 85% of these arrests, over 1.4 million, are for drug possession. So next slide, please. So again, the impact on the immigrant community, as Flo mentioned, the impact is on immigrants, on the child welfare system, on employment and social service. So on the intersection between criminal law and immigration law, we saw that drug arrest and war drives mass incarceration, as well as a mass driver of mass deportation and detention. Simple possession of marijuana was the 4th most common cause of deportation of any crime, and the most common cause of deportation for crimes involving drugs. Under federal immigration law, anything other than a simple possession of 30 grams or less of marijuana is a deportable offense. So if you have 31 grams, you could be deported or found inadmissible. It doesn't matter how long you have been in this country. Folks that have green cards, 30, 40 years, have houses, businesses, maybe even children. Obviously, children have no recourse under federal immigration law to regularize their status or fight their deportation. So over 40,000 people have been deported for drug law violations since 2008. Nearly 250,000 have been deported for nonviolent drug offenses in the past 6 years. So what's changed? What have we done? Several trends in criminal justice reform. We have been able to reduce prison populations through sentencing reform. We have also worked on scaling back collateral consequences of drug offenses, regulating cannabis, and expanding expungement for marijuana offenses. We're still heavily involved in that work. We're reforming justice, especially for our justice-involved youth. Still a lot of work to be done there, but these are some of the areas where we've worked in. And really just phasing out private prisons, right? We've been doing some of this work in California, also within the immigration context and within the detention context as well. These types of measures have basically resulted in a reversal of decades of upward trends of prison populations, which has fallen about 48,000 folks, or about 28% from its 2006 peak. So what's next? What are we looking at? I think for DPA and for other folks working within this context, we've really been thinking through that the next step, the obvious next step after the legalization of cannabis, is to decriminalize drug use and possession. DPA just scored a huge win in Oregon. We just passed Measure 110 that decriminalizes all drugs and allows folks to pay a $100 fine and seek treatment, as opposed to getting a misdemeanor offense on the record or being jailed for such possession. So what is decriminalization? Drug decriminalization is the elimination of criminal penalties for drug use and possession, as well as the elimination of criminal penalties for possession of equipment used for the purpose of introducing drugs into the human body. This even includes syringes as well. So why is decrim the solution? We definitely think there's so many reasons why decriminalization makes sense. It really takes drug use and substance use away from the criminal justice system, centers it within the public health system, really looking at treating folks humanely and with dignity to get them the services that they need. Part of what we're doing in Oregon is not only accessing treatment for folks, but we're also wrapping around any social supports that folks need, whether it's housing, whether it's food, whether it's employment. It's really trying to build out what recovery could look like for individuals. And we have to remember, a lot of our folks don't have access to recovery, right, or treatment services. And so the model that we're trying to build out in Oregon really seeks to really not only provide access to treatment, but to wrap around those services that will address the other issues that will help folks, not only the racial inequity issues that also affect our folks, but also the supports that they need on the road to recovery. And it's really just a cost-effective means. We're seeing even in Oregon, as opposed to $40,000 that could be spent to imprison someone or more, the cost of treatment is about $9,000 a year. So Measure 110 really addresses, really decriminalizes some of the hardcore drugs that we see here on this list, and is really doing some groundbreaking work, and we're going to be working really hard on the implementation. So what's next for us in California? We're looking at potentially looking towards some decriminalization efforts, either addressing decriminalization head on, or really just creating the infrastructure so that we're ready to have something like this in California, whether it's looking at health access and substance use treatment, to looking at reducing sentencing. Right now, we're carrying a bill that would seek to give judges more discretion in sentencing of certain offenses, including drug sales, which would allow judges to either provide treatment or probation. And so really just starting to center and taking these convictions or the way that we treat folks out of the criminal justice system and really putting them more within the public health context. And then in Oregon, folks have been really curious about what implementation is going to look like. I just have a timeline that I'm going to share with you all, that I will stop here so we have enough time to hear all the other wonderful speakers. And again, thank you so much for allowing me to be here and be part of this important conversation.
Thank you, Jeanette. I really appreciate hearing that bold demand to decriminalize drug abuse and possession. I join you in that and look forward to the opportunity for us to figure out what we might be able to do in California. Really appreciated also hearing that historical context and the way that you connected the past and the present for us. Now we're going to hear from three advocates. I consider these people to be my heroes and sheroes. Susan Burden, founder of A New Way of Life; Dorsey Nunn, Executive Director at Legal Services for Prisoners with Children; and Morningstar Ghali, Project Director of Restoring Justice for Indigenous People. We're going to start with Q&A amongst the panel, and then dive into your Q&A. For those of you who are watching, I just want to encourage you again to add your questions to the chat feature in the live stream. So you're watching on YouTube, please just go ahead and add your questions in the comments. Our team is monitoring the comment field. We'll come back to you and come back to your questions and incorporate them into the flow of the conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and begin, and I want to start with you, Susan. Susan, many people have heard of you and your work. You wrote the book, Becoming Miss Burton. And I wonder if you could just share a little bit with us about yourself and how you came to this work.
There we are. Mark, first I want to say thank you for holding these series of conversations. I want to thank Dr. Flo. I want to thank DPA and all of your partners and all of those that supported this. As Dr. Flo was going through her chart, I was getting so angry. I was getting angry because of the way I personally have felt the impact of what's happening and the way that my community has been devastated, as a result of the drug laws. And then DPA, I want to thank them. They've been a long time fighter for fair and just treatment around drug use. How did I come to this work, to this place here? I struggled for so long, and my father struggled, and my brother struggled, and my community struggled through the drug, through criminalization of just marijuana. I remember my father was arrested and put away for marijuana use, Mark, and treated as a slave as a result of that. I too was criminalized and put away for drug use after my son was killed by an LAPD detective, and I resorted to drug use and alcohol, and I was criminalized. I was chained, and I was put in prison, and I was made to work as a slave for the state of California. Mark, as I look back over my family's history and my life, Mark, there's not one generation of my family that has not been made a slave of because of the laws. Not one generation. And I know that Dorsey's working on involuntary servitude. And it's, I have hope when I hear DPA's presentation about getting involved and lifting the criminalization of our communities and our families around this particular piece, around drug use. But when I look at what happened in our capital, it's rather challenging and daunting to understand the way white supremacy, the foundation of this nation, shows up in our communities, in our schools, in the workforce, in the shopping, in the market, everywhere. What I also want to say is that as a Black woman in America who has been criminalized and who has been worked as a slave, I'm really, really, how would you say, just have this level of gratitude for the ability to rise up out of that and to bring others along with me and to fight for the right just to be free and help others fight for their right just to be free and have dignity, purpose, and meaning in their lives. But we have so much to continue to do. And I feel a responsibility to equip the young people. Jim, I'm talking to you with the young people. Yeah, to be able to stand and fight and understand the history, understand it's not just them. But I mean, there's an urgency. There's an urgency when white supremacists take over our capital, and those that should be protecting the capital align with them and say, you know, I'm a part of this too. So the overt and the supporters of those that are out and coming, it's just scary. But we walk through our communities and walk through our nation every day, confronting and dodging the landmines of white supremacy and racism every day. So I know I need to leave time for other people to talk, Mark. But I also want to tell folks, if they haven't picked up a copy of Becoming Miss Burden, be sure to pick up a copy of Becoming Miss Burden. It's all in there. But the next chapter, I have to write about that part.
Your story is still being written, and we thank you so much for sharing just a bit of yourself with us this morning. I'm going to bring others into the conversation. I'm going to start with you, Dorsey. Susan referenced your leadership and your work, and I wonder if you can just give people a bit more insight into how this war on drugs has impacted you and how you're fighting to repair the harm.
First of all, I'd like to thank everybody that I'm on the panel with in this presentation and the organizers of this event. And I'm really grateful for the doctor and her presentation because it affirms stuff that I knew. Drug Policy Alliance, you know, I've been hanging with y'all probably 20 or 30 years or something like that, you know, and I can remember showing up when I had some concerns about the way that we was introducing the legalization of marijuana across the nation. And I will start out saying that, you know, I have a long history of struggle. And most people see me just in the field of criminal justice, and they don't recognize that I'm a co-founder of a rehabilitation center, a community rehabilitation center in the middle of East Palo Alto that has a history of over 25 years. You know, and in the struggle, I can remember struggling and going to a DPA conference at a certain point, and had all of us non-members wearing T-shirts that said stuff like, "Let's not screw Pookie again," you know, and we was talking about equity, and you know, and we had them printed on the back, "Ask me why," because we already seen what did it mean when they did away with alcohol prohibition. Black people was known to be making cognac, and in fact, we still like it. You can pull up to the bar now, and you'll be hearing people talking about, "Give me the Henny, give me the Ramey." You know, that comes from a history of what we was producing in our neighborhoods. So we had we had distilleries during Prohibition, but that didn't transfer fundamentally and economically when we ended Prohibition. We had number runners that had a job in our community that was producing income for their families. And it didn't necessarily transfer when we went to lotto. And when we came to the question of marijuana, it may not be equitably transferring right now. It didn't transfer that way when it came out of Colorado and they legalized. And the market was that once rested on the back of probably people that people didn't like was given to other people who they did like. And it didn't mean that at the ass end of the day, we didn't have a problem with marketing marijuana when it was resting solely in our community. We was taking the blunt of it by going to jail on the real high numbers. We were actually being incarcerated in real high numbers. It seems like the racial overtones and racial implications of the drug war in this country is really, really clear, So I can remember my brother going to prison for 3 years for less than a gram of marijuana during his time in Soledad, and marijuana was prevalent in my family because my father smoked it. My brother smoked it. People in my community smoked it. And in fact, we marketed it too when we was calling it Acapulco Gold, Mish McCon, Tie Stick, and was naming the weeds after the people of the color who was actually engaged in the market on a serious level, Sticky Wicky. And it was coming through in the music also culturally, but it didn't mean that we was going to reap the profits when it was legalized to the most part, and we bore the burden of the arrest, which the doctor was laying out. So at first, I can see them still making massive arrests. We're doing a beatnik period, and we didn't actually change it and reduce it to any real significance until after we got hippies. And we went from felony convictions to misdemeanor convictions. And the way that we've been rolling it out in various states initially was through using marijuana as cannabis as for medicinal purposes, But even when we initially rolling it out, we still putting in poison pills that actually precluded people with conviction histories from engaging in the initial rollout of cannabis for medicinal purposes. So in the event that you should have had a felony when we first started, and we was creating a market that was walking towards recreational use, because even when you show up with for medicinal purposes, there's a greater objective that ultimately is going to be legal. But if you actually embed in the initial part of the process a poison pill that don't actually let people who had a real access to the market not engage in the market, you actually just tie lead boots on some people and they can't actually get their traction after it's legalized for recreational use. So it's like some parts of me backing into this question. When East Palo Alto was named as the murder capital of the United States, me and my homies decided that if we was going to have an alternative, we needed to build it for ourselves. So I got an organization that I'm affiliated with and I'm on the board of, and I'm a co-founding member that's over 25 years old, called Free at Last, And what we started doing was reconciling the fact that we needed treatment, because the only thing that they was offering was prison when we got caught with drugs or anything else. So I don't necessarily believe that we had a war on drugs. I actually believe that we had a war on people of color. And it was a severe war, and the numbers reflect who they were locking up, who they were caging. Whether it was the crack war or whether it was the first wave of the opium epidemics when he was punishing us. Before we got into it, it was going to be treated as, I just need to say, when white people show up, it seems like the treatment shifts when it started impacting their numbers in a real serious way. So like the opioid addiction of the day is being treated as a medical problem. In my generation, it was treated like go to the penitentiary problem, So it's like at a certain point, I think that my involvement in it, even when we was fighting for a real policy change, because Drug Policy Alliance was about policy change. When we was in that fight about let's not necessarily leave it up to drug courts, because we was recognizing when we was being processed through the criminal justice system who was getting deemed to be worthy of treatment and who were not being deemed worthy of treatment. So we started tampering with the laws. That actually meant that when we was tampering with the laws, that everybody would have access to the same degree of punishment. You know, and some parts of those things also impacted how we did other parts of the criminal justice system when we started asking for equity in sentencing, because we were not being equitably sentenced when it was just left in the hands of and discretions of judges solely, or in prosecutors solely. So for me, my involvement in this fight has been a consistent involvement, because I didn't necessarily see it as a drug war. I seen it as an assault on the Black and brown community, because that's where I've always lived, you know, and people were being hauled off and incarcerated in real ways. And, you know, and I can remember when I first met Susan Burton, and I went down and seen a New Way of Life. That day was a great day for me, because I seen that there was another Black person and a person of a different gender that had dug in and was doing real serious work, and was picking up people at the bus station, and was housing people, and was actually taking them off that train that was taking us into prison. And I was doing the same thing in East Palo Alto. So some of us you recognize as doing different things around criminal justice issues. But if you dig down a little bit deeper, you can also see that we are building institutions. So I think that Susan's institution is probably 23 years old. Free at Last is 25 years old. So it's that far back when we start building institutions that actually offer relief to people in our community who were addicted, and even more important, when we want to protect them from the grasp of slave catchers, because they kept sending us to prison and claiming that they didn't have another alternative. So we built an alternative to incarceration. At certain points in this fight, Susan always impact me, and I need to say, I think white supremacy trumps data. And if you don't recognize it, we just had an election where a person won by over 7, 8 million votes, and they still call them illegitimate. So the data in itself is not enough to sustain this argument. So how do we actually sustain an argument and change the narrative? Because I used to always think that if it was data driven, that it will show up and people can look at it and say it's aha. We may be the ones having the aha moment right now. You know, because the election we just had was data driven. And the aha is white supremacy still wind up attacking the Capitol. And in reality, that same degree of supremacy made us actually make an exception in the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution that codified slavery, slavery in law. And I'm definitely into the fight of actually divorcing ourselves from vestiges of slavery. So when we fight about, have questions about, should we still be able to subject people to involuntary servitude in the California Constitution? That's a question for everybody that's on here that's from California. Do you still think that we should be holding on to vestiges of slavery and not necessarily attack it in a real way? Because it's the same question. That's how come the doctor's numbers is reflecting that. And I didn't talk a long time, and I can see you breathing hard.
I appreciate that, Dorsey. I appreciate you ending on that note where you kind of shared the double standard and showed how, people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color in particular have, kind of always fallen short, and how these issues are really kind of embedded in our history. And when we talk about our Indigenous loved ones, I really want to use this opportunity to kind of bring Morningstar into the conversation. Morningstar, you've been doing a lot of work in Indigenous communities for your entire life. And I wonder if you can just share a little bit about how you've seen the war on drugs impact Indigenous peoples and what is currently happening in Indigenous communities.
Thank you, Mark. Just want to say Chimisanwi, greetings to everyone here, and it's really an honor to be included on this panel with Ms. Susan Burton and Mr. Dorsey Nunn, with Dr. Flo. Thank you to Policy Link and Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. Thank you to Jeanette and all of your amazing work that you have done. We are very grateful on behalf of Restoring Justice for Indigenous Peoples. Just in light of what has recently occurred, I just want to speak to what Ms. Burton said in the 528 years of white supremacy that has upheld this country. And we see that very much reflected in this conversation that we are having and how our communities have been affected by the war on drugs and why the need for decriminalization is so evident. So I will just speak to my own personal experience, that being born and raised in Oakland, California, attending junior high at the age of 13, I was expelled from junior high school, sent to juvenile hall for a possession and sales charge. My parents were told that I would never attend another public school within Northern California again. This very much changed the trajectory of my life, where I was had to move away and move out of the Bay Area, and then attended another high school where I was again expelled and started working at an early age, working full time as I had dropped out of high school. I want to say that, you know, there's been a really severe impact where 60% of the marijuana that is consumed within the US is grown right here in California. And so, you know, the impacts that has on our tribal lands, the environmental impacts of industrial cannabis use within farming affects the habitats of our traditional plants and our traditional foods, such as our salmon and trout that we are fighting for restoration of through Save California Salmon. There are many disparities on how grows and growers on and off the reservation have been treated, not only by federal agencies, but the danger within our communities and to community members. When unlawful grows happen within tribal lands, there are runoffs from pesticides that affect our tribal watersheds with disregard to people that live off of the land. And so that really is why decriminalization is needed, because it will help to support the health of our watersheds, of our tribal communities, and restoration of our lands. That's still here within California. It's been 3 years now that there have been efforts to pass a bill to address tribal cannabis businesses. At this time, tribal cannabis businesses can only acquire licenses that will allow them to work with state legal operators if the tribe agrees to cede all licensing power to the state, which impedes on tribal sovereignty issues. And so it is my personal commitment to support Indigenous families and families of color that have had similar experiences, and to uplift decriminalization and healing for all of our families.
Thank you, Morningstar. Really appreciate you uplifting the impact and talking about it from the perspective of what's happening on tribal lands. I don't think that's a perspective or an understanding that many people actually hold. So I appreciate you lifting that up. We have a few questions from the audience that I want to turn to, and then we'll hear another presentation from the Youth Forward team, from Sarah Michael Gaston at the Youth Forward team. One of the questions is really about, are there any popular kind of media tools that we can use to engage young people, young adults, in understanding this history around the war on drugs? And I wonder if specifically, maybe Jeanette, you have any thoughts about that you can share, so that we can just hear what tools or resources might be out in the space, if any exist at all.
The Drug Policy Alliance has a curriculum called Safety First, which is really about drug education for youth. And so it does have a historical context, which I think is really phenomenal. It has teaching modules. But I have to think to see if there's any resources directly that would speak to you. And I think I mentioned there is a documentary, and it's a roundabout way of getting there, but there's a really good documentary on Netflix called Los Tigres del Norte, and it really just chronicles the 50th anniversary of Johnny Cash's historic concert at Folsom State Prison. And what struck me about the documentary is, at the beginning, they clearly talk about how Johnny Cash was singing to a predominantly white audience 50 years ago. And when you look at the audience, the folks that are behind bars at Folsom State, it's Black and brown folks. And they interview a lot of the folks that are there. And the majority of the folks have a drug conviction or some connection to drug addiction. And so it really just, to me, it just spoke volumes about like how significant those 50 years have been in changing our own state's prison population. But I'll definitely put a little bit more thought and put something in at the chat or at the end of the series just to give folks more insight into more resources that are available. But there's, it's really about just connecting the dots and seeing sort of like how the war on drugs has evolved and looking at the data that Dr. Coffer showed us. And for me, it's just really a matter of just connecting the dots for folks around this issue.
Mark, I just want to add that we really should have something that is actually built and created for young Black folks to understand the history and how it connects throughout the, Morningstar said 528 years. Morningstar, that's the first time I ever heard that. But how it connects throughout time. And there has to be something that's created for our, particularly for, our Black folks, our Black young people, to understand the history and how it's tied to slavery, suppression, supremacy, oppression. So I just wanted to add that, Jeanette. And, I'm so happy you're here. And I didn't know who was in the state director, but we need to work in California to pass some of those laws. So I'm looking forward to connecting with you.
Yeah, I would just add to the book by Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, has some really good historical analysis. It hits a nail on the head, Susan, around the evolution of the war on drugs as well, and really does a great job of connecting the historical dots for us as well. But that's also a read that's out there that I found it's been really helpful and looks at the whole history of Black folks in the U.S.
Yeah.
Hey, Janetta, one of the things that I need to bring up is that I got a lot of resources. Drug policy helped me to do a lot of advocacy around, telling that story. And I can remember getting an advanced copy of it and reading The New Jim Crow. And my phone call, I think my first phone call was to Susan when I ran across her name in the book.
Yeah.
The next phone call was to Ethan Edelman, saying that he should actually support it. And we was there at the conference when she actually spoke to Drug Policy Alliance.
Yeah.
That's beautiful history, and thank you so much for sharing those resources, Jeanette, and for the call to action, Susan. I think that we absolutely need more resources to help popularize this history that you all are holding and sharing with us today, and this information, and do it in a way that's grounded in the racial and kind of cultural context that so many Black, Indigenous, and other people of color throughout California kind of live within, so that it's relevant and actionable for them. One of the other kind of related questions, I'll just get to this briefly and then go to Sarah Michael, is, when we think about young people, how do we gain the trust of youth and young adults who are affected by the war on drugs? What do we do about the glamorization of drug use among young people? This is a little bit of a different generation that young people are growing up in now versus the experiences some of you have had and shared, and even that I've experienced myself. And so how do we reach people who have a very different understanding of substances and substance abuse, and help them to understand some of what is out there and what they should be concerned about or mindful of?
So, Mark, we build trust. You know, we work to build trust. It just doesn't show up and happen. It's things that we do that actually do build trust. So I work with women who are exiting prisons and jails and coming into a new way of life after they've been traumatized, tortured, and all trust, faith, and belief has just dissipated, has just been eroded, has just been broken. And what I do daily is rebuild trust with them. And it's actionable. It's how you show up, you know, and it's how you support. It's how you understand. It's how you reach. It's how you don't condemn. So all of those things is what we should be doing with our young people and with each other. So that's what I can say about trust. It's what we build with one another in ways that, you know, say, I can trust, because so much trust has been lost, and for good reason. But that's the community building also that we do. That's the strength building. That's the healing that we do.
Hey, Mark, you know, one of the things that I think that we should also do is build opportunities and not throw them away. Yeah, because you know, some parts of it, you know, I was already in prison serving a life sentence at 19. I believe people start throwing me away when I was 13. So that, you know, and in my organization, I make it a point, even though my focus could be on more elderly people, is to make sure that the next generation that come behind me have an opportunity to work there, because sooner or later we're gonna have to turn over the shop to a different group. You know, so like, you know, if you got and I would say that about formerly incarcerated as well as young people. If all of these people who are making money off of this issue, if you don't hire some young people, then because it's going to be a protracted struggle. If I could have won it earlier, I would have won 40 years ago. So, you know, we may need to start actually making sure that we may need to make sure that we got them in our ranks when we actually moving forward, and giving them some decision-making ability, because, you know, you could, you know, have brilliance there. And if you ever think about how old was Martin Luther King when he was speaking out, he was a younger person, you know, and some of our greatest leaders came up under the age of 35 when they stepped out.
I appreciate that organizer wisdom. Thank you, Susan and Dorsey. Morningstar, would you like to add a final piece before we transition?
Sure, I'll just add that, you know, it is an intergenerational approach and an intergenerational effort. And it's so important to have our younger generations mentoring us as well in terms of what they are experiencing at this time, because it is such, you know, such a different reality. You know, our communities of color have always accessed marijuana use and accessed non-Western medicines. And so learning about the traditional uses, of not only marijuana, but of the plants that help to heal us is really important to share that knowledge, and to share the knowledge about the impacts on our water systems, and that should be, you know, a responsibility of all recreational and medicinal users and growers in terms of the water usage, especially here in California, and how that's affecting our water systems. Again, going back to the sentencing on federal lands and how Indigenous peoples within California have been held within federal institutions, and the excessive sentencing that they have received on that also needs to be addressed. Back in 2015, with my tribe, with Pitt River Tribe, there was an industrial grow that our tribe had been working on, and it was rated by the BAA, by federal agencies that are supposed to be upholding tribal sovereignty. And so this is still very much an issue that needs to be addressed and worked out, especially in terms of equity on the criminalization within tribal lands and the severe punishment that Indigenous peoples are receiving when they are also trying to assert sovereignty and economic opportunities, just as many of the cannabis companies are flourishing within California.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Morningstar. I'm going to transition to the Youth Forward team, and after them, we'll come back to some other questions that have been asked in the chat, and they're more policy related. So we can have a little bit of dialogue about some of those after a presentation from Sarah Michael. Sarah Michael?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Michael Gaston with Youth Forward, and I'd like to take a few minutes and share some of what we've been learning about the multiple intersections that exist with cannabis policy and racial equity. In the upcoming sessions, we will explore many of these intersections. As you've heard today, over the decades, cannabis policy has made a major contribution to mass incarceration and remains a key issue in criminal justice reform. Prop 64 made an important contribution to reducing incarceration by decriminalizing cannabis. This, however, continues to be an area of concern as public officials call for a crackdown on the underground economy and seek to further criminalize communities of color. In the area of tax policy, we see local governments and the state bringing growing amounts of revenue from legal cannabis. The cannabis industry was deemed an essential business during the pandemic and has continued to grow. In a later session, we will share research that shows that many local governments are using cannabis tax revenues to expand law enforcement. This, in our view, is simply wrong and represents a continuation of cannabis criminalization and the war on drugs. In regard to the environment, we have heard from tribal communities that have suffered environmental damage on their lands due to illegal cannabis grows. This is also an issue for urban areas, as cannabis grow houses and businesses are often disproportionately located in low-income neighborhoods of color. In the area of economic equity, we see a clear pattern that cannabis industry is primarily benefiting white investors and is quickly becoming a corporatized industry. In a later session, we will hear from Black entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color who are struggling to establish businesses in this sector. The issue of health equity is a complex one, as cannabis use has both positive health impacts and harmful impacts. We are particularly concerned about the ways in which the cannabis industry is boosting THC levels and the harmful effect of high THC products on youth mental health. Finally, cannabis policy is playing a larger and larger role in local and state budgets. Here in the city of Sacramento, where I live, the city is experiencing real growth in its revenues due to local cannabis taxes. In the next session, we will have presentations on 4 state grant programs that collectively will invest about $100 million in grant funds in the coming year to local communities impacted by the war on drugs. As you can see from this brief overview, we have much work to do to ensure that as Proposition 64 continues to be implemented, we won't see a new version of the war on drugs emerge, and that instead we will see an equity approach when it comes to economics and to tax appellations. In closing, on the next slide, I would like to lift up that in our work on cannabis policy, we need to track 3 different policy arenas: the federal government, the state government, and local governments. At the federal level, cannabis is currently designated as a Schedule I drug, meaning that it is viewed the same as heroin and other hard drugs. This federal policy creates multiple problems for research, for banking, and for criminal justice. This is likely to change in the coming year or two with the Democratic presidency and Congress. It's also important to note that Prop 64 gives local governments a lot of control and authority over cannabis. Local governments can do the following: tax cannabis, place stricter regulations, and develop their own equity programs, which are city and county programs that support people of color starting cannabis businesses. Please join us in the upcoming sessions as we look at policy and at opportunities for organizing and advocacy that support racial justice. This concludes our presentation, and now we will move to the question and answer portion of this session.
Thank you, Sarah Michael, and thank you to your colleague Jim for pulling this together. And I want to get back to some of the questions that were posed by people who are watching. One of the questions was around just some of the local conditions and circumstances. And I wonder if between you and Jim, you can kind of tag team or at least join me in trying to respond to this. But it essentially is trying to understand how some of the counties and cities can, make cannabis illegal in spite of the state legalization, if you will. And so trying to understand the context between what is allowed for locally and what the state law is, and how the revenues from legalization are impacted by that landscape. I know that that's not as straightforward as I would like it to be, so apologies for my failure in translation for those of you who entered that question, but there are a few questions related to that area, and so I'm trying to merge them all together, and I hope that that gives you enough to work with, Jim and Sarah Michael.
Sure, Mark. I'm happy to respond to that question. So when we look at the implementation of Prop 64, we come across the fact that Prop 64 gave local government a lot of control over how implementation happens at the local level. So local cities and counties can have the authority to allow or not allow cannabis businesses, dispensaries, cultivation, etc. And also local governments that allow for cannabis businesses have the ability to create and tax cannabis for local revenues. So we have a kind of a two-tiered system when it comes to taxation: the taxes that the state of California places on cannabis, and then the taxes that local governments place on cannabis. And those taxes at the local level vary considerably in terms of the degree of tax. And later, we have a later session focused entirely on local cannabis taxes. And we did an analysis of numerous local governments to look at how they're allocating local tax revenue. And we were greatly concerned to see that for the most part, local governments are using local cannabis tax revenues to expand law enforcement and to fund general government, as opposed to using those revenues to reinvest in Black communities and communities of color that were impacted by the war on drugs. And in that session, upcoming session, we'll have some organizers who are working at the local level who are in a fight to change local policy and steer those revenues to a better purpose.
Thank you. Thank you for articulating that. There's another question, and I'm going to turn to you, Morningstar, to just share a little bit about how this is playing out on tribal lands. The panel, the person who's watching asks, could you reiterate the licensing dynamic for operators conducting business on tribal lands?
Sure. So tribal cannabis businesses can only acquire the licenses that will allow them to work with the state legal operators if the tribe agrees to cede all licensing power to the state. So this is an infringement on tribal sovereignty, that our tribal nations and tribal lands are inherently sovereign nations. And so this has, again, been an extreme challenge. There has been a bill proposed. It's for the past 3 years. It has not passed. And so I know that they are working on getting some successful legislation passed for this year, but that it is definitely, there are barriers still within my tribe, Pitt River Tribe, as I mentioned, that we had an industrial grow back in 2015 that was rated by federal and state and local entities, and our tribal economic development still has not recovered from that.
Thank you, Morningstar. So, we're dealing with a series of dynamics, the complexity of the impact of the war on drugs and, how we move forward to repair the harm involves not only decriminalization, but equity considerations in terms of economic development. And, there are other questions that, we have to wrestle with in terms of access. And one of the questions that people have lifted up who are watching is, and there's a person who's referenced in here. I don't know who this person is, but maybe the panelists do. Can the panelists speak to the point Wally Wong made about decriminalization not being the same as access to the marijuana industry and how we have to deal with both simultaneously? Morningstar and Jeanette, I see you both nodding. Would you like to take that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a distinction between decriminalization and legalization, right? It's one thing to decriminalize and move the penalties away from the criminal justice system and try to center folks within the public health arena and provide them those supports within the legalization context. You're looking at a whole other system of regulations, processes, even local processes. And so it's definitely, different. They're two totally different things that sometimes folks kind of talk about interchangeably without kind of knowing the differences between the two, and really recognize that within the legalization context, there's just so many layers that need to be worked through in order to make things more accessible, especially for our communities. It hasn't been, it hasn't been as we envisioned it initially, and there's so much work to be done. So I totally agree with that statement.
Thank you. There is another question about roles and how people can engage. So one is asking about how healthcare and recovery spaces can be involved. Another is asking about how faith leaders can play a role. And I wonder if folks have any reflections on that. I know in the Black community, the faith leaders they play a prominent role in influencing the community. I wonder, Dorsey or Susan, if you have any thoughts about faith leadership. And Dorsey, I know you started a recovery center in East Palo Alto. I wonder if there are thoughts you might want to offer about how those sectors in particular can be more actively engaged in this particular element of the movement. I know that for recovery centers, they tend to be passive recipients of, either resources and just servicing people who are coming to their doors, but is there a more proactive role that they can play?
I think they can play a more proactive role, but we got to recognize that a lot of treatment centers within marginalized communities are being subsidized through state and county funds, and sometimes even federal funds. I know at Free at Last, that when it came down to criminal justice issues, when we was doing Quest for Democracy, I would always pull up in rent a bus and have them jump on the bus so they can actually see how state government look like, you know, in relationship to churches. I think that then became a lot more liberal than they used to, than they were, because I can remember that their hesitancy around the question of AIDS and other issues that they came as a result of drug use in our communities, that they were a little bit slow pulling up to the table. But I actually do think that there's space enough to actually go and do a political education within the context of churches and activate them in a real way. Probably the other thing that I was sitting up here thinking about on local stuff, the first time that I started hearing about conversation about marijuana equity, it was coming from a person by the name of Desley Brooks in Oakland. And she started trying to put into place equity measures that ensured that people who had been arrested in communities that had the greatest histories of arrest would get access to actually putting out the market in a real way. They have access to the market, because I think that this is $1 billion industry. I think that when she stepped out of there, I think that she could have possibly lost her seat, because on some parts of this initial struggle about what we do with the marketing and where it's actually able to take place and who actually able to reap the benefits of marketing, that haven't been equitable in a real way. And some of the initial people who were actually on that fight lost their jobs as a result of that, because when they came in the way they came in with medical marijuana, the opposition had more money to actually to donate. And I can remember picking up flyers, and as a poor person, when we're putting out flyers, our paper is really thin. And when you start feeling the weight of the flyers being extremely thick, you start actually questioning who has money to actually produce that stuff. So it's like I'd ask us to actually think about more than the churches, who are the elected officials in their area that we need to focus on to actually get the change that we want. And we probably have to develop better relationships with them if we're actually going to protect our neighborhoods and our communities.
I just want to add a little to what Dorsey said in regards to treatment facilities and the requirements that they feel like they have around the resources that they receive. And it's almost as if these places of help become crippled and their voice taken and the good of the community lost because of the resources that they're receiving and the way in which they interpret those resources to rob them of their voice or what's best for not only the individual, but the community at large. So when I talk about freedom, I mean freedom. And, you know, in the book, Mark, you know, I talk about giving them their money and telling them that I won't operate the way they want me to operate. And it was a hard choice, but it was the best choice, because freedom is freedom, and we can't become what Dorsey calls is house slaves for the master. He uses another word, but I'm not using that word. But we can't become oppressors under the lash of the resources that we receive. So I just want to say that. And what I also want to say is that when I did push those resources back at them, the resources came in double the amount. And I believe it was because I was doing the right thing.
Hey, Susan?
Right.
I believe you need to clarify how much money you gave up with within your structure when you threw it back to the county. How much money did you sacrifice in order to have your freedom?
I had something like a 700,000 or so budget at that time, and a little over three of it was coming from them. So I was like, okay, I won't get paid. Okay, I'll copy the paper on both sides. Okay, I'll tell people maybe they need to use their cell phones and the phone to go, whatever, but I was not going to give up my freedom.
I appreciate hearing that. And with that, I think that's the perfect way to close. This movement that we're a part of, this work to repair the harm is going to require truth telling, it's going to require struggle, and it's going to require sacrifice. And at the same time, I believe that we will overcome. I know that we will win. And I'm so happy to be in partnership with all of the people who you heard from and so many more. A special shout out and thank you to Public Health Advocates, Drug Policy Alliance, A New Way of Life, Legal Services for Prisoners with Children, Restoring Justice for Indigenous People, and our co-sponsors, the California Endowment, the California Community Foundation, California Wellness Foundation, Liberty Hill Foundation, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, and the California Department of Healthcare Services. Stay tuned. We have several upcoming sessions which are displayed on the screen. We look forward to sharing more of our loving set of truth tellers with you and more information that will help you to be able to participate, receive some of the funding, and actually engage in some of the advocacy to heal your communities. With that, thank you so much. Goodbye.